Welcome back to The Heat. What's next for Ukraine? Will it be more conflict and tension, or could there still be a peaceful solution? Well, joining me now from London is Alexander Nekrassov. He is a former advisor to the Kremlin. Alexander, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
We now have a peace plan on the table. That peace plan has been endorsed by Russia. Russian President Putin has also asked Parliament to rescind that resolution, which calls for authorizing military force against Ukraine. So we have all these developments, yet NATO and the European Union saying that's not enough. What do you make of this?
Well, unfortunately, the ceasefire agreement, which is now in place, does not really hold well, because we are seeing bombings continuing, bombardments, and we saw a helicopter being downed by the anti-government protesters. There are incidents, constant incidents on the ground. So it's not like this is a proper ceasefire. Now, I think that the President Putin was right in asking the Federation Council to abolish that executive order by allowing him to use military force on the territory of Ukraine to protect Russian speakers. But unfortunately, I don't think this will work, simply because this is a lull before a bigger crisis will erupt. That, unfortunately, is just a temporary measure, because on Friday, President Poroshenko will sign the full free association agreement with the European Union. That's the economic part. And I suspect after that, what will happen is that we will see more fighting resuming on the ground and in the air. And I suspect that this particular ceasefire agreement was introduced simply because the Ukrainian government wanted to be seen as sort of peace-loving before the signing of that free association agreement.
Right, that agreement that you're talking about there, that was what initially set off tensions in Ukraine. So once the signing takes place, is that likely to aggravate tensions once again?
Well, I suspect it will aggravate tensions on all levels, because I think that once Ukraine becomes a sort of a full-blown free association member of the European Union, we will probably see some sort of toughening of the language in the EU, and also probably we will see some toughening of the language and even actions on the part of the Ukrainian government. I think that at the moment there is really a confusion of how to proceed further on. I don't think that the talks which are going on at the moment between Russia and Ukraine, and partially with the European Union, I don't think they're really bringing any results. Because don't forget, when President Poroshenko introduced this ceasefire agreement, one of the conditions was that he was not going to talk to any of the anti-government protesters, branding them as terrorists, and asking them to put down their arms. And this just doesn't work like that. This will not lead to any resolution. This can only create more tension.
NATO foreign ministers are meeting at the moment. That's ahead of a full NATO summit, which takes place in Wales in a short while. This is what the NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen said. He said member states are discussing how to deploy NATO forces in response to Russian capabilities. What does that mean?
Well, Anders Rasmussen is talking simply because he is adding pressure on Russia. There's nothing very much that NATO can do at the moment. It can't really threaten to move troops into Ukraine, because Ukraine is not a member of NATO. It has already deployed certain elements surrounding Russia, but there's nothing much it can do really, because already we have heard President Obama stressing several times that America has no plans of involving any military of its own to use it against Russia. There are American advisors on the ground in the Ukraine. That has been known for some time. But I don't really think that they can do anything much. I even think that there's still tension between America and the European countries about the so-called sanctions, tough sanctions, as that has been hinted in the, among the Western politicians, that they're supposed to introduce even this week. But they were caught off guard by President Putin's decision to abolish that ruling about the use of military Russian force in Ukraine. So I think that there will be a change of attitude towards that. Unfortunately, as I said, the diplomatic contacts at the moment are not really working very well. I don't really see any ground, that common ground that can be found in the next, I don't know, month or so. So let's just hope that there will be some sort of movement on the ground in Ukraine between the protesters and the Ukrainian government, and hopefully some sort of a push by Russia as well.
Right, Alexander, sanctions have already been imposed, and there's talk of more sanctions. In fact, German Chancellor Angela Merkel says sanctions could be tightened if efforts to stabilize the situation are not speeded up. NATO also saying that Russia is not living up to its international commitments. In this respect, when we see President Putin ask Parliament rather to rescind that authorization to use military force, is he acting under duress?
Well, I think it's pragmatic what Putin is doing. I think that what he has done is that when President Poroshenko introduced his ceasefire peace plan, and Putin obviously said publicly that he supports that, everybody was waiting for him to respond to that. So what is he going to do? I think he decreased the tension somewhat by removing that authorization to use military force, because it was putting pressure on Ukraine and its government and its president, and I think it was an irritation point for the European Union and NATO and America as well. So I think that was the right move. Now, I think the West wants more concessions. I think the West is expecting Putin to sort of start saying that, maybe providing proof that there are no Russian arms flowing into Ukraine from the Russian territory, that there are no Russian troops building up on its borders, which he has been doing, but it seems it's not enough. Now, I personally think, as a former advisor and troubleshooter for the Kremlin, I think there's a lot to be done behind the scenes. I think the rhetoric, which is coming from basically all sides, is not really helping. I think that although NATO, on the one hand, obviously is trying to put pressure on Russia, discussing, military moves and so on, it's not the sort of situation at the moment that is helping. I think there has to be concessions made by all sides. I think that President Poroshenko is looking behind his back and always having to think, what is Americans are thinking? What is the European Union? What are they thinking in Brussels? Because he does not really have a free hand here. He always has to watch his back, if you know what I mean. I think this has to change. There has to be a very, very proper dialogue happening between Russia, the EU, America, and Ukraine. There have to be maybe some sort of, absurd plans discussed. Maybe even there is, there have been certain scenarios mentioned where Crimea can be sort of bought out by Russia, where Russia has to pay for Crimea to Ukraine. There has to be an agreement between Ukraine and Russia on the gas and its prices. We see nothing like that happening. We only see the talk about pressure, sanctions, punishments, and so on. This will not help. Until this goes, nothing will help this crisis to be resolved.
Right, and when we listen to the demands coming from European countries, from the United States as well, implicit in those demands is a belief that President Putin has a switch which he can turn off and on insofar as support for the pro-Russian separatists are concerned in Ukraine. I mean, does President Putin have that kind of influence over what is going on there, over what the separatists can and cannot do?
Well, it's very important to remember that once Crimea has joined Russia, there was expected to have a chain reaction was expected in eastern and southern Ukraine as well. Now, I suspect that Putin and the people in the Kremlin are not exactly very happy with what is happening in eastern and southern Ukraine. I don't think they have that sort of control over the anti-government protesters that the West thinks they have. In fact, in the past several days, we have witnessed some of the leaders of the anti-government protesters in the east actually criticizing Russia, saying that Russia is not doing enough to help them, saying that they are suffering high casualties because of Russia refusing to get involved militarily in the East. So I think we shouldn't overestimate the power that Putin exercises in the East and South. And I think that there are elements there of the extremists who will do anything to cause trouble.
Right. Alexander, one quick issue, and I've only got 30 seconds for this. NATO, the Secretary General, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, also saying that that alliance is now 28 nations. NATO reserves the right to grow bigger. No third country will be allowed to prevent that. What do you make of that?
Unfortunately, yes, NATO is going to spread eastwards. That is a fact. And this will only annoy Russia and irritate Russia even more. I think this is going to be a serious bone of contention. I think this will only add more pressure to the crisis in Ukraine.
Okay, thanks, Alexander. Alexander Nekrassov there talking to us from London.